Good afternoon, everyone. I am Jessica Smith with the Center for Inclusive Transition Education and Employment at UW-Whitewater. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for the day, Minnie Bredouw, Designing for Inclusion. Minnie is the Executive Director of Purpose Project, a nonprofit founded at IDEO, a global innovation firm. She also runs her own business, Studio Bredouw, focused solely on designing for equity and inclusion. She has spent most of her career designing programs focused on inclusion, equity, and education reform, such as a multinational reproductive health program for teens, a digital coaching platform to help first-generation college students succeed in higher education, and a program to help transitional age youth involved in the justice system learn more about their rights to help prevent recidivism. She has been featured as a keynote speaker at the World Bank, South by Southwest, United Nations, TEDx, and the World Design Summit. And her work has been featured in Bloomberg, Fast Company, and the World Economic Forum. She is also an educator, teaching classes on inclusion and design for social impact at the graduate level. She writes and watercolors in her spare time. Please join me in welcoming Minnie.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Jess. I'm glad you left the part about watercoloring in there. Hi, everyone. It's great to have you all join us today on this October afternoon. I'm so excited to be speaking to you about this really important topic of designing for inclusion. And I hope that everyone will see this as a bit of a conversation. So I'll try to keep my eye on chat, and Jess as well, if you can keep your eye on the chat, that would be great as we go through. All right, I'll just jump right in. So as Jess mentioned, I myself am an educator. I've worked with students from all walks of life in different parts of the country and the world. And I think it's really interesting when we ask ourselves how we can not only take practices that we put into the world as folks that are trying to create a more equitable and inclusive environment, but actually teach those skills and actually bring those to life for others. And so today what I'm hoping we can do is start a conversation about the intersection of design and innovation, which is what my background is in, with the application to creating a more equitable system for everybody. And so that's what we'll spend time talking about today. And I'll just jump right in. All right, so inclusive design. What is it? What are we talking about? There's two important words here, inclusive and design. So first, to start, I'll unpack that. The way that I've defined inclusive design is a proactive and ongoing process of designing services, systems, and infrastructure with communities that are historically underrepresented. I'm going to break this down for a quick second. The first thing to note is it's proactive and ongoing. Rarely do you have a service or a system that is 100% inclusive, and I think we all know that. But the most important thing that all of us can be focused on is embracing a growth mindset and continuing to be curious and checking in with ourselves as both individuals and practitioners and asking, what are we doing each and every day to build a more inclusive environment for the people that we're working with? Another important distinction here that I've underlined is the word with. I think one thing that's super important for all of us to be conscious of is that when we're creating environment solutions, education systems, inclusive workplaces, it's not about the people that know that context well. Let's say you're an employer looking to hire a broader community of individuals. And we see this a lot right now with recruiting, right? Where we have all of these recruiting requirements about hiring a more diverse workforce. It's important that we're also rethinking the system within which the communities will be benefiting. So if you think about not just saying, oh, we're going to create a more diverse quotient of folks that we're hiring, but actually working directly with the communities that you're looking to attract, to redesign and rethink the environment within which they're working. I'll talk a lot more about that today, but I want to call that distinction out early, because the most important thing we can do is not, think that we as individuals or we as an organization hold the power, but in fact, it's our job to move that power around and to think more about ourselves as enablers and think about ourselves as a part of a much bigger ecosystem. So 2 things to call out about this statement. Let's dive in and really unpack what that means. Before I go any further, I want to just caveat that all of you are designers. So I get this a lot as somebody who lives in Silicon Valley, somebody who's worked on many, many projects with large corporations to kind of think about innovative ways to bring new ideas to life. Every single one of you is a designer. Every single one of you is creative. You design products, systems, businesses, infrastructures, technologies, programs. Just the way that you write a brief is unto itself a design process. And so anything that's been designed can also be redesigned. And so when I use the word design, I want you all to be thinking about this as design lowercase d, rather than design some fancy title that only, folks wheeling and dealing in the world of Silicon Valley uses. Because again, we're all creatives and we all have a creative capacity to rethink how we do things together. As Jess mentioned, I worked at an organization called IDEO for many years. At IDEO, what we do is we rethink processes and systems from the ground up. And so when we think about the way that we define innovation or design, it really comes at the intersection of 3 things: the needs of the business, the ability to build or implement something, the feasibility, as we call it, and most importantly, the desirability, the human needs. And so what we use often in my industry is a term called human-centered design. And what that means effectively is that we're thinking about how to create more innovative solutions that are directly inspired by the people that we're looking to serve. You may have seen a graph similar to this. This is something that gets commonly used in the world of human-centered design. And I think it's important for all of us to ask not only, what will improve the outcome of our business and what do we have the capacity to build, but how can we actually be looking at the needs of the individuals to inspire what we're creating and what we're moving in terms of our, developing programs and systems that can support that. Inclusive design can represent many dimensions of diversity. So today we'll be focusing more heavily on individuals who might be differently abled one way or the other, but inclusion is representative. When we all look at the sort of definition of inclusion, it requires thinking about the notion of intersectionality, thinking about how might someone's gender intersect with their physical ability, or how might someone's faith intersect with their ethnicity or race. And so one of the most important things that we can do is we're looking more to create more equitable systems, is really understand that intersection of identity. And again, we'll talk more about that as well. One note on inclusive design: it often gets conflated with this notion of universal design. So the idea that we can create a more inclusive workplace, for example, that the more we sort of chip away at that, the more we can start to do something that works for everybody. And I have an example I share that is connected to innovation. Seems a bit analogous, but I think there's a lot of parallels. Does anyone know what this is? It was a cockpit for a fighter jet. I don't think the chat, let me see if chat is open. There we go. Okay, I have my chat box open too if anyone is commenting or has questions as I go. So this is a really fascinating story. In 1941, it was when they were looking to sort of redesign the cockpit of the fighter of the one of the jets that was being used in the war, and they thought, okay, we know we need to redesign this, and we know it's not quite working for a range of folks. So they went in and they, I think, had hundreds and hundreds of different men, and they measured their height, they measured their head size, they measured their foot size, and they took all of these things and they averaged it out, and they created something that fit right in the heart of kind of all of these different diverse dimensions and proportions. And of course, this worked for no one. This ended up working for not one person, because none of us are the norm. None of us fit this sort of standard definition. And so when they went back and revised it, they realized it's about creating affordances that make this work for a range of folks. So that was when they started developing, adjustable seats and adjustable steering wheels and all of these affordances that actually made this inclusive for a broad range of folks. And while it's a really simple and obvious solution, I think it's a nice metaphor for really the definition of what inclusive design is, which is actually thinking about those small and thoughtful affordances that actually create a more inclusive solution, rather than saying, you know, once we get to a certain point, we've created something that could be universal for everybody. Another thing that often gets overlooked with the sort of lens of inclusion in many industries is, in fact, how high the stakes are for this. So this is an example of crash test dummies, which actually were not, they weren't required to have female crash test dummies in their testing until only 7 years ago. And so consequently, female drivers were 47% more likely to be seriously injured in a car crash. And again, it's just something that over the many years and over the ways in which the auto industry had evolved, it was something that got overlooked. And we see things like this all the time when we're actually really looking at some of these policies that have not actually enabled communities to benefit in the same way that another community might. So again, I just call the statistic out because it's pretty staggering at what the stakes can be at times when we don't make the effort to create more inclusive policies and processes. So a few provocations as we dive into some of the ways in which we can approach inclusive design in a more holistic way. I believe there's about 5 of these sort of questions that I always encourage folks to be thinking about. So one thing that comes to mind is, you know, what challenges are hidden in plain sight? This is a graph from Vox, which is a great publication, and they asked this question, or they basically did this study that realized that, you know, we're all pretty aware of the inequities. One second here. All right, we're all pretty aware. I'm gonna go back to screen sharing. Full lead. Sorry, guys. There we go. We're all pretty aware of the challenges with pay inequity in the workplace, but something that's more nuanced, that's not as obvious, is that even if we do achieve pay equity, for example, once a person becomes a parent and have kids, there's actually a drop as well in how much that person, it's their earning capacity following the birth of a child, which is not affected by men. So again, this is a very nuanced example of exclusion that may not be as obvious if, for example, the initial amount that a person is being paid in the hiring process is somewhat equal. We also have to look at the nuance of how things show up in a more sort of systemic way. Another challenge that we should be thinking about with inclusion is actually creating the sort of community that is sort of building these policies and programs needs to be diverse unto themselves. And so this is an example of Snapchat, which came out, 6 or 7 years ago now. The first 2 years, these face filters did not work for people who had dark skin. And I'll give you one guess why. And that's because there weren't people with dark skin on the team that was building and designing this app. And so again, if we are trying to be thinking about creating more inclusive policies and we don't have the right people on our team to be doing that, we're going to overlook sort of things that may indeed have an adverse effect. And so this is another really important question to be asking, is how are we actually creating inclusive and diverse teams as we're building these policies? Speaking of policies, a lot of this does come sort of at the much higher level, and we can be thinking about ways that we can kind of force inclusion through these policies. And so just 2 years ago, California created a law, in fact, that you couldn't have an all-male board, which quickly transitioned and changed the way in which people were thinking about and designing their boards and in turn their companies, by having to then say, okay, well, this is a mandate. So I have to be thinking about this when I'm building my board. And so inclusion can come at the policy level as well. We see this a lot when we're looking at some of the things around the pay gap. And it can also exist when we're thinking about folks that are joining the workforce who may have a different set of abilities. And we can be asking ourselves, what policies are in place to make sure that we're actually setting these individuals up for success? In addition, it's as I mentioned earlier, it's not enough just to invite new people to the table or to be designing a more kind of inclusive policy around bringing people, into that community or into a program, but it's actually important that we're creating, that we're actually making people feel welcomed and people feel represented. And so again, this is a sort of a quick and easy sort of to digest example, but this is a really interesting thing. I think this was in, I'm not sure what city this was in, but you can see that they basically redesigned the construction sign to include men and women at work. And I think, again, it's those tiny affordances that we may sort of forget to recognize when we're just moving through our everyday life and been blind to it. I mean, I myself am a woman, and like it wouldn't even have crossed my mind because I'm just so used to seeing that sign that just speaks to, men at work, basically. And then last provocation before we dive into some ways to sort of think about this more in an applicable way is, how can we design for delight and embrace the joy in what makes us different? So I think it can be often a little heavy to talk about inclusion and equity, especially right now while we're remote, while we are dealing with a very tumultuous election. We're in the midst of a civil rights uprising. There's a lot of things going on in the world today. And one of the things that's important to not forget when we're really asking ourselves how we can create a more inclusive environment for more people is that delight and joy doesn't have to disappear. In fact, this is a really wonderful New York Times article that came out 2 years ago titled Designing for Access, where they hired a bunch of designers to come in and rethink some of these different tools and affordances for people who are differently abled. And what I really loved about both this hearing aid and this prosthetic leg is that in neither case are folks attempting to hide this or attempting to treat something that might be different from the person next to them as a detriment, but in fact embrace and highlight the beauty of that difference. And when we look at a lot of the things that people have been historically a bit hushed about, it's something that we can't learn to change our thinking and our perception around unless we bring out what the beauty in those differences and the beauty in the differences that we all share. So I put links to all of these articles at the bottom when the keynote is shared, and everybody can go and learn a little bit more about this as well. And one of the biggest questions that I get from my students when I teach a week-long class around designing for inclusion is, how can I convince my employer that this is really important? How can I go back and actually make space for a more inclusive environment and culture and policies within my company? To which I always say, your business will benefit. There will be growing pains possibly in the beginning, but the thing that we see time and time again, this is just one of many statistics that speaks to this, is that diverse teams outperform those that aren't. In the UK, for example, every 10% increase in gender diversity, earnings before interest and tax rose by 3.5%. And when you think about communities, whether it be, through ability, through race, through gender, through whatever dimension of diversity we're looking at, if you have a more diverse team that is building and solving problems, you're actually going to have a broader market, if you really want to look at the sort of breakdown of the financial viability, to speak to, and that feels represented in whatever it is that you're bringing into the world. And so diversity and inclusion isn't a nice to have. It's actually going to make for better, more profitable businesses as well. All right, so this is a moment where I want everyone to just take 1 minute to reflect and ask yourself, with some of this top of mind, what is one aspect of your organization that could be more inclusive? And this could be anything from your hiring processes to the environment within which people are working, to a mindset or a way of talking, that might not be as inclusive as it could be. So just take a minute to reflect on that, and I will stop talking and give you a second to think. And you're welcome to share any of your reflections in the chat or anything that is top of mind for you as I'm sharing with you all. All right, let's dive into some mindsets that can help enable some of these big questions that we just talked about. So the first and most important thing that we can all be doing is to recognize exclusion. It's a tricky thing because it shows up everywhere. And like I said, it's not always obvious to the naked, untrained eye, but there's a lot of ways that we can start to do that. And one example I give to designers who, I'm working with is this notion of, right, like the color nude. This is a example. I think they've changed this. I think Pantone has since changed this, but I think there was in 2016, in the early part of 2016, Miss Obama wore this nude dress, and everybody was saying, wait, the dress is called nude and it's not the same color as her skin, right? But we look at these examples, across the board in the world of what's been designed in our products that, no one's really stopping to reflect and kind of ask, oh, there's bias inherently embedded in what we created. This is a tweet that I saw earlier this year that brought me a lot of joy. And Dominique Apollon says, "It's taken me 45 trips around the sun, but for the first time in my life, I know what it feels like to have a Band-Aid that is my own skin color. You can barely even spot it in the first image. For real, I'm holding back tears." And so again, like something as simple as a Band-Aid can make such a big difference in representation. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. There are so many things that we haven't begun to tackle and unpack. And part of my career has been continuing to move through different parts of programs and processes that we can actually look at and think about creating a more inclusive environment. And I'll talk about some of those in a little bit. But again, you can kind of see like something as tiny as this can make such a difference in the lives of individuals. This is an example one of my coworkers sent me when I sent out an email asking about when you feel excluded. And this is a sign that lives in her hospital. And I'm sure it doesn't take anyone here to guesses to figure out why this might be exclusive or feeling exclusive. And she has arthritis, so she's often getting like her knees drained when she's there. And she just says it just every time makes her just laugh. Like, why would you put this in an office where people are coming with arthritic problems and often can barely kind of get themselves out of the hospital, much less take the stairs. Again, so picking up on context and nuance. And speaking of context, something that's important for us to remember too is that it's going to be different. Inclusion looks different depending on where you are in the world. So when you look at Saudi Arabia and female drivers, that is a completely different lens of inclusion than we might have here in the US, where that's never been a challenge. And so really understanding, taking the stairs might be a perfectly reasonable thing to have in a place where you are, training, having people train for a marathon or train for something, where you want them to be like physically moving or something like that. But actually understanding really what is the context within which we're creating some of these solutions and systems. And that's actually, I think, a wonderful way to start understanding where inclusion should be showing up and how exactly it does show up. And I think another just exercise that I've done with my students that has always been a really helpful eye-opener is we do what's called inclusion walkabouts. And if we were all together in one place, I would actually have you all go and do this. But what I have my students do is go out into the world and they all will take like a different card for a different person. So and it's someone that's not your own, not your own lived experience. And when they're thinking about things like physical ability, for example, this was some photos that one of my students had taken and brought back. She said, well, all these bikes are parked here. So if you were in a wheelchair, it would actually be really hard to get around these bikes. And, again, for her, it was like, I needed an opportunity to go out with a fresh set of eyes. And so much of design and innovation is bringing that fresh lens and really being understanding and thoughtful to others' lived experiences. And you'll see in this picture on the right is this very large door that was in the beginning of the entryway of the building that we were teaching in, which is not in any way friendly to those who may not be able to pull a larger door, whether it be an elderly person, a younger person, a person who has a different sort of physical ability. And then someone else said, they put this handrail here, but it doesn't really add much value. There's still stairs. And so again, you can just walk around your neighborhood, on one of your many COVID walks, which I hope we're all taking a lot of, and start to put on different hats and say, what would this experience be like if I was hard of seeing? What would this experience be like if I was in a wheelchair? What would this experience be like, if I didn't speak English or English was a second language? And many of you have these lived experiences, so put a different hat on. But I think when we think about inclusion and exclusion, it's important to adopt a fresh lens that isn't your lived experience and see, how does the world change for you when you go through it in that way? This is something that I just share with everyone. You can Google the intersection of privilege, domination, and oppression. This is something that anybody who does work in this field is pretty familiar with. So apologies if many of you have seen this before, but if not, I think it's an important tool. You just can Google the wheel of oppression. I know it's a little bit of a heavy title for a search, but it will start to show you all of these different dimensions of diversity, and historically who's sort of sat at the been a dominant beneficiary or less dominant in the way in which the US has sort of been designed from the ground up. And so this is a really, for my students, what they do is they will pick a different dimension of diversity that is not their lived experience and try to experience that through the lens of talking with other folks, going through the world with a fresh set of eyes. And it can be really empowering to start to break down your preconceived notion of what the world is and how it's existed for you with your lived experience and your identity. So again, I love to sort of have folks reflect and think about their own experience. What I have my students do is take a minute. I mean, they take longer than a minute, but for everyone in this virtual room, take a minute to think of a time that you felt excluded from an experience for an aspect of your identity you had no control over. Almost everyone has answers to this. There's a couple people who sometimes go, I've never felt excluded in my life, but most people do. So just take 1 minute to reflect on what that experience felt like for you. All right. We'll have more time to do some of exercises like these in the workshop session that I'll be hosting this afternoon in about an hour. So but I do want to give time to reflect. It's a bit more awkward when we're in this remote setting, but I do think it's important to not just be listening to me talk for an hour and a half. All right, so recognize exclusion. Lots of ways to do that. The next sort of step to recognizing that exclusion is then recognizing how has it affected my specific lens as an individual in the world. And a lot of that comes through bias. I call these lenses or biases. There's a lot of ways that can show up. But the thing that I always say to folks is that when we're solving problems, whether it's through designing something, whether it's through building a new policy, what's always at the core of that problem solving is you, is who you are and how you've come to be. And how is that shaping the way that you're showing up as a contributor? And so it's not about, it's about understanding these biases. It's not about defeating them or overcoming them. And I think that we all, to some extent, can look on the surface and say, oh, I'm this way because I grew up here, or I'm this way because, I'm of this political leaning or this religion or this ethnic background. But what's important to also recognize is that biases exist for a reason. They're there for a reason. They're not inherently negative or bad. This is an example of dots on a page. But if you squint at it, and again, if we were all in a room together, I would ask you to say, what does this look look like, but you can probably see that it looks somewhat like a dog, like a Dalmatian. And that's just our biology telling us that our lived experience would tell us that that is the shape of a dog. And therefore our brain tells us, okay, it's a dog, right? When it's really nothing more than dots on a page. And that's exactly how biases are. They're neither good nor bad. They just are. This is a nice, I think, one of the more visual and kind of accessible breakdowns of what some of the biases that show up in our everyday, and some of the biases that can impact the way we see the world and the way we look at others' lived experiences. I'll talk about a couple of them, but again, there's a link at the bottom. So all of the things I'm sharing, you can look up and do more of your own research on. But a couple common ones that kind of affect the way in which we make decisions and design solutions is availability heuristic can be one of the most common. And basically, this is the fact that we will kind of make these mental shortcuts in order to make decisions or evaluate topics. And one of the examples, when I have a bit more time to do a workshop around this topic, is that I put up these different sort of slides, and we look at something like, what is the most common cause of death in the US? And, there's suicide or homicide, and almost everyone picks homicide. Well, it's actually, there's a higher percentage of suicide, but it's not the thing that we hear in the news. It's not the thing that, we're actually seeing shared. And the same is true with like natural disasters. We hear a lot about those, but there's actually a lot more kind of high challenging things that kind of affect the health of people. And it tends to be what the news shares with us, what our social circles share with us, what we see in our own bubble. And again, getting outside the bubble is as important as ever right now with an election coming up. So this is something to be really conscious of, and really asking, how can we get out of kind of that smaller cycle that we tend to be surrounded by. We know confirmation bias, folks are probably pretty familiar with that at this point, but we'll tend to interpret things that confirm our own preconceptions. This happens a lot in the design process, actually, where we will go testing an idea with different people or different users. And what might happen is we hear one thing, from a few folks, like 3 or 4 folks in a row, and go, okay, that's probably the feedback we should take into account. And it can be harder to take the divergent feedback if we've already heard positive feedback about something 3 or 4 times. So being conscious of when and how those patterns that you expect to see may be disrupted is another important aspect for us to think about. In-group, out-group bias, we see this all the time with sports. No matter how hard I try, I can't stop loving the Seahawks because I grew up in the Northwest. I was just watching a Seahawks game with my dad, and I was like, what would happen if I just tried to root for the other team? Like, could it be possible? And so again, like, how do we start to look at how that in-group or out-group bias can affect us as well in the world of thinking about designing inclusively? And then this is the last one I'll share. There's plenty that you can explore on your own, but trait ascription bias, which I think is so fascinating. It's that we see ourselves as more variable than others. So we start to say, well, I have the ability to kind of change and think differently, but I'm not so sure about this group. And definitely we see a lot of this in the world of the political environment that we're in right now, and sort of seeing our own party or our own perspective as more progressive, or more, we're thinking about it in a way that's different or unique from the other side of the aisle. So again, just some examples of what we can be more thoughtful about, and this research can continue on your own time, and I'm sure many of you are already experts in the topic. But I do have sort of a few reflection questions for folks as they're thinking about how bias might show up in their own work. Because again, it's not about shifting those biases, it's about balancing our biases with another point of view or another perspective. And so again, we'll do an interactive exercise on this in the workshop following, but thinking about what are my lenses? How does bias show up in my work? Like, where are places where bias has been showing up? And are we making any assumptions? And so gut checking yourself to ask these 3 questions can be really helpful as you're building, more inclusive programs and policies in your environment that you work in. So yeah, this is a lenses exercise I have all my students do, and I'm excited to do it with folks in the room when we get a chance to do our breakout session. All right, you still with me? Now getting into some of the more sort of action-oriented approaches to how we can be thinking about this work. One of the most important things I share with folks when they ask me about how to be designing inclusively is that we need to be designing with and not for. It's really important when you look around the room that you see that representation of folks that you are actually hoping to serve. That I can't like stress this enough. When I work with clients, I always say, you know, the funder, let's say it's a foundation, I say, you know, you may be sort of funding this work, but my client is actually the person who's the end beneficiary, and they need to be the ones that have sign off on this. And I won't work with organizations that don't adhere to that belief system and to that mental model of how things should come to life. So what that means, there's a term that I've been using quite a bit, which is this term of pathological altruism, when well-meaning efforts in fact worsen the situation they were intending to solve for. A pathological altruist might be somebody, for example, who is you know, trying to save a bunch of animals, or, you know, and adopting them, but actually not creating a good environment because they can't support them. And, you know, I think that it can show up in a lot of ways. But this is something that I read an article by a woman by the name of Liz Jackson, who is an advocate for designing for disability, in fact. And she said, you know, this is one of the most challenging things that I experience as somebody living with a disability is this mindset of pathological altruism. And just to disband that and dispel that is like the number one thing that I tend to do. I try to do as a practitioner. And so, you know, I know many of you have a background in working, you know, thinking about social work and understanding, you know, trauma-informed care, but it can be a little bit challenging when we don't normalize and socialize that beyond only folks who are focused directly on kind of the social implications of supporting different communities and creating equitable outcomes. So what I've encouraged every partner I've worked with, every designer I've mentored, every student I've had, is to actually go and take a trauma-informed care class, because, well, first off, let's face it, we're all experiencing some form of trauma in this exact moment in time, and it can't hurt. It can't hurt to be more trauma-informed. The people in your life, with the kids that you might interact with, or children you may have. But moreover, it helps us start to really build a much stronger muscle around thinking about how to be supporting communities that are not our own. And in fact, I teach a design for ethics class. And what I say is, you know, we really shouldn't be stepping foot into a room that isn't, you know, designed around us or our lived experiences until we've done a lot of homework completely outside of the fact. And I had a client when I worked with system involved youth. I worked on this project for about 2 years, where we were designing a system to help them learn what their rights are in the context of the justice system that Jess alluded to. And her language was, don't learn off the backs of others. And I just love that exact sentence. I think it's a really perfect encapsulation of that mindset. And so the more that we're giving ourselves space and time to learn and become students, especially if we do not have a lived experience that is mirrored of a community that we're working with, not only are the more, I think, thoughtful and well-designed the solution is that we'll be creating, but ultimately, we're just going to become better people. So it's kind of a win-win if you think about it. All right, so in terms of what this looks like in practice, this is an example of something that wasn't trauma-informed, but had, or excuse me, this is an example of this term pathological altruism, which I shared. So has everyone seen this? This is an OXO handle. It's like a kitchen utensil that you might have seen. There was a big overhaul on the redesign of these. And you can see on the far left was this little peeler that was hard to hold, especially if you were arthritic or had any trouble with kind of motor function of your hand. And on the far right, you can see this really kind of grippy, easy to hold tool that, you know, might be a bit more inclusive of a solution. So in theory, in practice, this is a more inclusive design. Having said that, the process through which this was designed was a bit tokenistic in nature, and I'll share why here. In sort of the context, you'll, I think, hopefully understand the reason why, which was the woman. This woman was inspired by this woman, Betsy Farber, who had arthritis and was working in the kitchen a lot, and she would wrap duct tape around the kitchen peeler to make it more grippy for her hand with arthritis. And while that was a really inventive and kind of unique solution that inspired the OXO handle, Betsy was never given any credit for the solution that she came up with. She was never actually given ownership of that problem that she ultimately had kind of hacked and solved on her own. In fact, she was kind of tokenized in the process as like, oh, we saw she was struggling, and so we designed the OXO kitchen handle. And so ultimately, yes, there was a lens of inclusion that was brought to the table, but it was done so where her involvement was ultimately tokenized. And what should have happened is she should have been the one that was given credit for rethinking how this experience came to life. And so the distinction and the nuance there is pretty subtle, but it's not enough to just create something that we would perceive as a more inclusive solution. We have to give credit to the individuals who have helped us think that way, think through the solutions and the ideas, and make sure that, again, as people who are building policies in more inclusive environments, we're really nothing more than a conduit for those stories, and we're not aiming those stories towards the people in power or the people who may be sort of at the helm designing something, but actually folks that know the space so much better and are the ones who are building the tools. So I wanted to just paint that example out because I think it is a nuanced way of thinking. This, on the other hand, is a really cool project that a friend of mine, Kate, has been leading, which I think is kind of the opposite. So this is with young people who have limb differentiation, and they're thinking about prosthetic limbs, and not only kind of providing input, but they're actually designing like what their dream limb would look and feel like. And what you can see here is a lot of enthusiasm, a lot of creativity, and ownership over this process. And again, with the notion of designing for delight, it doesn't have to be something that is sort of hushed or not part of a sort of mainstream conversation, but you can actually put young people or whoever you're working with right in the driver's seat and be like, you tell me, and let's like do this in a way that like you feel like you have complete control of the conversation. And this happens every year, and these kids basically can really speak to what would inspire them and what that experience would be like. So I think there's something really special about opening the conversation up to be bright and to be open and to be framed in sort of what could be. And then this is an example of a project that was done around the voting, making voting more accessible to individuals who were hard of seeing or wheelchair bound. And I think it also illustrates and paints a great example of how to create an inclusive process. So I have a video here, or Nick, if you want to tee it up, either way is fine. I can give this a shot and we can see if this works. Let's see.
The last time I voted was in my neighborhood back in 1970.
Can everyone hear does that sound all right?
Here, I'll go ahead and play it.
Okay, cool. Thanks, Nick. I'll pass it over to you then.
The last time I voted was in my neighborhood back in 1970.
I don't hear any sound on my end.
It was all with eyesight, and I would go into the booth and had to read all the measures and all the people that were running and make my mark and then put it in the ballot. So all the tapes up here. After I went blind, It was a lot more complicated to the point where it discouraged me from going. So I just decided not to vote anymore.
Today, we still vote in Los Angeles County on voting equipment that was originally introduced in 1968. That is a voting system that hasn't kept up with the times. Based on the 2014 election cycle, we had some of the lowest voter turnout that we have seen historically in LA County. It's symptomatic of a trend that we're seeing all over the country. So then the question becomes, why are people not voting?
40 or 50 or 60 years ago, when we created a lot of our voting systems, we weren't thinking about things like the Americans Disabilities Act. We weren't thinking about things like Americans speaking 80 languages, because they can't access the actual technology. People don't feel included in the process, and our voting systems are not accessible or inclusive or engaging or delightful.
And so let's start with a blank slate, and let's not look at this as an equipment replacement process, but let's look at it as designing and modernizing the voting experience.
Welcome to the 2018 general election. To begin, touch the circle on the touch screen.
Project Vox is an effort to bring voting into the next century.
We're not designing a machine. We're designing an experience. What's beautiful about redesigning an experience is that it encompasses users' need from the very beginning to very much after. We did the user testing sessions encompassing different people with different cultural background and with different physical disabilities.
Ernie is somebody who has come into our process, come into helping us co-design this voting system. We've had him come in about once a month to really get down and dirty with us, to help us design, to help us refine. He's also someone who isn't afraid to tell you when you're not doing it right. I'm going to be here if you have any questions, but let's just see how it goes for you, just exploring this on your own, and let me know if you need anything, and I'll stand right here.
When I first used it, I more or less reached out, found what I needed to do the work, and did it. It starts talking to you, how to put in your ballot, how to find the tablet to vote. I give them my suggestions to which one would be the best. And the suggestion that I picked was not so many buttons, because we are blind, and when you have too many buttons, it kind of gets a little confusing. But I was impressed by how much work they had put into it.
Along the way, we have had probably a dozen iterations of this voting system. We're really proud to say that over 400 voices have contributed to this project. We're also proud to say that those voices all played a really big qualitative role in creating the design that you see today.
It's important that we get this right, because if somebody has a positive voting experience, they're much more likely to come back and vote again in future elections. If they have a bad experience in voting, or they don't feel like it had the impact that they wanted, the chance of them coming back is reduced exponentially.
It's incredibly heartening to understand that the system we're building is going to allow people who have never voted or who haven't voted in 30 or 40 years to come back into our democracy.
I'm going to be able to go back to voting. Each time that I come here, I see improvements, and I can't wait till we see it in action at the polls.
Oh, Mimi, you're still muted.
Thank you, Nick. I think that example is something that really brings to light the notion and the concept of co-designing, which is foundational in the way that we should be thinking about these problems and the opportunity to be more inclusive, and not just what we make, but actually how we create new, innovative, and thoughtfully designed solutions. So, oops. again, a reflection question to all of you, which we'll have more time to focus on in the breakout room, is what are you doing as an individual to be bringing more diverse voices and perspectives into your process? And how can you be co-designing in a collaborative way? If anyone has pen and paper, feel free to even write this down too. All right. I'll move on, but again, I hope some of these reflections can stay with you as we're all thinking about, designing and sort of for the next iteration of whatever it is that we're working on right now. All right. The next thing for all of us to sort of sit with is this notion of solving for one, but extending to many. This was directly inspired by the Microsoft Inclusive Design Toolkit, which was created by a woman named Kat Holmes. I'm not sure if all of you are familiar with that toolkit, but it's a wonderful sort of set of resources to be thinking about how we can be drawing from a wider range of abilities and experiences to make things actually better for everyone. So what I mean by that is that when we think about disability as a personal attribute, we're actually not leaving a lot of space for innovation and a lot of space for rethinking how things are done. But instead, we need to sort of shift our mindset to thinking about disability as context dependent. And yes, doing that from the lens of inclusion and just, more of a trauma-informed care lens is important, but moreover, it's actually going to create more opportunities for us to create more kind of design and innovation within all of these different environments. So for example, I may have a physical impairment that means I'm not able to drive a vehicle, but I may have an incredible knowledge of, audio engineering and actually be able to share that knowledge with the world in a completely new way. And so I think that if we all kind of look at our own lived experiences, there may be places where each and every one of us feels like we're struggling, to achieve or accomplish something in one context, and we're an expert or have an incredible strength in another. And so again, I think as we start to look at opportunities for innovation, thinking about those contexts can really start to open up new avenues and opportunities for design and innovation. I have a link to the Microsoft Design Toolkit, but one of the examples they provide that I think is a really sort of lovely way of framing it is that when we create affordances who support individuals who have historically been excluded, they can actually have a much broader impact on others that may not, that may have other situational impairments or challenges. So if we look at somebody who, for example, has one arm, and we design explicitly for that, we may actually create something that can work really well for someone who has an arm injury, or a new parent who's holding a baby and doesn't have the ability to use one of their arms. And so again, there are permanent, temporary, and situational challenges that can actually be solved explicitly by solving for a community member who may have a sort of a permanent ability that or disablement connected to that specific thing. And the same can be said for sight, for example. So if we're looking at somebody who may be visually impaired, it actually is going to also benefit somebody who may have a cataract or who has just gotten out of an eye surgery and is unable to use sight for, a temporary amount of time. Or in fact, if we think about this day and age, somebody who's a distracted driver and may need to be seeing something very quickly in order to react and engage with, for example, a moving vehicle. And the last example that I think is again, just kind of another build is this notion of if we're designing for someone who is deaf or who can't hear all that well, we're also creating a better solution for someone who has an ear infection, or a bartender in a busy bar that can't actually hear what people are ordering. So again, there's something really special about looking at opportunities that actually afford better solutions for a much, much broader range of people beyond those individuals. Let me see. There we go. So another reflection question for this group is, was there a time that you built empathy for another community that actually helped you better understand exclusion, or better understand an opportunity for inclusion? So again, just give a minute to reflect and think about this question before we move on to the next section. Loving the music, Nick. All right. Let's keep going here. So this is something that, consider the opposite. This is something that comes up a lot in the work I do around ethics and ethical design. And important and foundational to the work around kind of inclusion and equity and what we create is really thinking about, how are we planning and accounting for when things don't go as we expect? And B, how are we measuring impact? When we say that we're doing something inclusive, or let's say, I'm just going to give a really concrete example. Let's say you are the manager at, in some environmental workplace, let's say post-COVID days, because this is a bit different in the moment, but, and you're actually putting accessibility ramps in throughout the building. And the assumption is this is going to make a more inclusive space for the people that work here. Understanding and having a feedback loop, and understanding and having an ability to make sure that it is indeed doing what your intention was set out to do is a really important and shouldn't be forgotten aspect of designing inclusively. And so a couple of examples that I talk about, they're slightly analogous, but I think hopefully help paint that picture, is what are some of the unintended outcomes of disruption, like who might be excluded when we come up with new ideas. And so an example here is when we think about ride sharing, again, this is all a little bit nuanced with the world of COVID, but when we think about ride sharing, there's actually folks that inherently were then excluded in this process, which would be people that drove cabs or people that were, working in public transportation. And so when we're thinking about creating new ideas and putting new things in the world, it's equally important that we ask, what could the negative outcomes be from what we're making? And not being afraid to ask that question. There's nothing wrong with the possibility of something not going right, but to not address it or to not openly ask the question is where we might be doing ourselves a disservice. This is an activity that I do with my students and my teams all the time called Dichotomy mapping. It's from a toolkit called Designing Ethically. And it's actually where you plan for what could go wrong or what won't go right. So for example, this is an image of thinking about the IBM Watson and thinking about what's beneficial to visual recognition or natural language classification, to things that might actually help create a more inclusive product, for example, if there's ability to, use more visuals or process languages. But at the end of the day, there could also be a negative outcome or something that goes, that happens in an unexpected way. And so sort of acknowledging and planning for that can really set us up to create something that has a much more sustainable impact than just simply something that we perceive as innovative and putting it out in the world and then not actually tracing or tracking the effectiveness over the long run. One other example that I think is really interesting is this notion of a monitoring checklist. So thinking about How is this going to continue to work autonomously? How transparent are we being in what we're creating and how we're creating it? What are some of the questions around safety and how this will actually continue to create both a physically and emotionally safe space for the individuals that we're working with and for? So these are just a few examples. Other folks use a tool that I use another tool called a theory of change. I think many folks who work in nonprofits or social impact have used the theory of change framework. All of this I can make available. I have a resource list that everyone can pull from if the Wisconsin folks want to share that later on. But really, it's up to you and your organizations. But just make sure you have something in place to measure and trace the impact of what you're putting into the world. So a couple of reflection questions that you can use with your teams and colleagues is, who might disagree with what I'm creating? You know, who's out there that might say this isn't a good idea, and why would they say that? What might my intervention or idea or creation be challenging? Are there beliefs? Are there people who might feel one way or another? Right? It's important that we hold optimism and hope close to us as we're trying to affect impact in a positive way, but also asking what or how might this be possibly confronting a fear or an issue that others might have. And then what is the long-term implication or impact of this? So if you set goals around, the coming year, and you set key results or indicators of those results, maybe you ask, what would that look like in 5 years? What would that look like in 10 years? What would that look like in 25? Starting to really do that. I have another activity I've done with my students where we look, to these very distant futures and actually ask, what is the sort of cycle of what we build, and what is the systemic impact of these interventions as we create them, both in the here and now and for many years to come. All right, and then last thought starter and sort of mindset before I open it up to any questions folks might have. Most importantly is that all of us, everyone from folks that are investing in this space to folks that are implementers to folks that are thinking about sort of being end beneficiaries and beyond, it's important that we look to learn from our experiences. And I mean, I'll be the first to say, when I started teaching this class, I look back and I just think of how much I've learned since I began my own journey of asking about inclusion and equity. And every time I teach, I probably taught this to over 10 or so different cohorts of students. And every single time there's a student that makes me think of something in a new way or changes my perspective. And I'm sure many of the educators in the virtual room can relate to this one. So it's important not to gloss over those moments of learning, but actually take them and integrate them into your own practice and process. So when we don't get it right, we've seen this as well with the work being done right now with becoming more aware of anti-racism and how to put that into practice with all of the incredible work going on right now around thinking about how we can be more inclusive in that space as well. And it's okay to not get it right, but you have to acknowledge that and move on and seek to do better next time, right? It's as simple as that. And so I share this example. I don't know how many of you saw this article. It came out a couple years ago when the first female CEO of National Geographic took over. One of the first things she did was put this article out into the world, which was about their racist coverage in the early part of the 19th century. And, they would call Aboriginal people Aboriginal and savages and things that were actually, if we look back on it, pretty appalling language. And instead of sort of saying, all right, well, we're going to do something different and those days are over, she addressed this head on. And I think it's important for all of us. We see this in other more corporate settings. We see Patagonia saying here's ways that we could do better, in the context of retail and sustainability. And the more that all of our respective organizations can actually say, here's where we have room to grow. We're being honest with people, our stakeholders and our end beneficiaries, but B, we're giving ourselves continued opportunities to innovate and be more creative. When I see organizations sharing all of their successes towards a more inclusive culture or a more inclusive workspace, my first question is always, what haven't you gotten right yet? Or where are you still looking to grow? And not only is there nothing wrong with acknowledging that, but I think we owe it to ourselves and to the communities we're looking to serve to acknowledge where we're still growing. I'm certainly still growing myself, and I think we can all be open and honest about that as much as anything else. So a few questions, again, to sort of ask yourselves as individuals and to ask yourselves as organizations. What am I doing well? What could I be doing better? Do I need to slow down? And how can I reframe a mistake in a way that helps me learn something new? So I'm going to give everyone just to reflect on this. I think we have some time, so I'll just give you 1 or 2 minutes just to ask this question to yourself and reflect, and then we'll open it up to a bigger conversation. All right. More time to reflect here in a bit, but just to kind of close this out, here's a summary of the 6 things we just chatted about, but I shared with you, and I hope we get to chat about more. So recognizing exclusion and acknowledging exclusion, being aware of our lenses and how bias shows up both in our own minds and the way we perceive the world and the world around us as it gets baked into products and services. Designing with and not for, being very conscious of setting up our processes so that we're not only serving the needs of people that may be outside of our own experiences, but also bringing that point of view and perspective in every step of the way. Solving for one and extending for many. There's a lot of people that can benefit from a lot of this work that we're doing in innovation and design. Thinking about the opposite and measuring our impact along the way, and embracing a growth mindset as we go. So with that, I'll just leave you with a few closing thoughts. The more diversity we bring into our process, like the better what we make is going to be, period. It's going to serve a better audience. It's going to serve a broader audience. It's going to be a better product or service or system or policy or whatever it is that you design. And I would encourage all of you, as you're going back out into the world of wherever you are coming from and wherever you are kind of working, to be asking ourselves, how might we inspire one another to create more inclusive policies, programs, and services in our own respective fields? And we'll spend some time together workshopping and thinking about some of this, or putting some of these provocations into practice here, if anyone wants to join for the session that we'll have later today. And if not, this is a few sort of questions that we talked about that you can be integrating in your own process. So again, this is in the keynote. And thank you all so much for taking the time. It was a pleasure speaking with everyone today. I'm happy to open it up to questions for the last 10 minutes if anyone has any. All right, if we don't have any questions, I think we're able to wrap. I'm not sure, Jess, if you or Nick, if you can see the folks, and I don't see anything in the chat, so.
I don't see anything in the chat, and if they're like me, I feel like people are just taking everything in and really digesting and excited to dig in the breakout session. Minnie, thank you. Just what a great talk and a great framework for us to challenge ourselves with those provocations. I love that term, those questions, and really encouraging us to be mindful and focused in a new way, and thinking about how people with disabilities and other lived experiences can really bring value to the product and outcomes. And those different perspectives are in and of themselves creative and creating that better product. So what a great conversation, and I encourage the folks to continue thinking about those questions as we transition into our break and then the breakout sessions. So we will be beginning the breakout sessions at 2:30 Central Time, so we have just over 15 minutes. Minnie will be in this same breakout room, breakout room number 1, and Tipper Thomas, our keynote speaker for tomorrow, will be in breakout room number 2. So you'll need to scroll down on the virtual streaming feed below the main video, and that's where you'll see Tipper's breakout room if you're interested in listening to Tipper. Both sessions will be recorded, so if you're having a tough time choosing, please know that you will have an opportunity to watch a recording of the other session. If you want to participate in the breakout sessions with video and microphone, please follow the instructions that will appear on your screens. You will want to keep your video and microphone on to join, and then mute your microphone while your presenter gets set up and then calls on you. And you'll be directed to your breakout room after you follow those instructions. So with that said, we will see everyone at 2:30. Thank you.
Thank you.